The room went silent the moment the papers hit her hands. 200 people, crystal chandeliers, a Christmas tree glowing behind them, and in the center of it all, a woman holding divorce papers she never asked for with a pen, shaking so badly she could barely hold it. Her husband didn't raise his voice. He didn't hesitate. He simply placed the pen in her hand and said, "Sign." She felt every pair of eyes on her as she did. The judgment, the satisfaction, the certainty that this was the end of her story. But what none of them knew, not the man divorcing her, not the powerful family watching her fall, not the phones quietly recording her humiliation, was that 3 hours earlier, a phone call had come in. A call no one was meant to survive. A truth buried for decades. A name that would shatter everything they believed they owned. Because the woman they were about to throw out into the cold that night was standing at the beginning of something far more dangerous than revenge. Before we go any further, tell us what time it is where you're watching from, and drop your location in the comments. And if you're drawn to stories about quiet strength, hidden power, and moments that change everything, subscribe now and stay with us, because this story doesn't unfold the way you think it will. Now, let me take you back to that night. The first thing Elena Hart noticed wasn't the cold champagne soaking into her sweater. It was the sound. A sharp, hollow splash, too loud for a room this expensive. The laughter that followed landed a split second later, bouncing off crystal chandeliers and marble floors, curling through the air like it belonged there. Elena stood frozen in the center of the ballroom, champagne dripping from her hair onto the white papers clenched in her trembling hands, while 200 well-dressed guests stared at her as if this were part of the evening's entertainment. Connor Hale didn't flinch. He stood just a few feet away, tall and composed, in his tailored black suit, one arm resting comfortably around the waist of the woman beside him. She was elegant, in a way Elena had never been allowed to be. Sleek dress, flawless makeup, posture trained by rooms like this. The woman smiled politely, as if she hadn't just watched Elena's humiliation unfold. "Elena," Connor said calmly, his voice carrying, "please sign the papers." The pen felt heavier than it should have. Elena's fingers shook so badly she nearly dropped it. Her ears rang, the laughter fading into a dull hum as she looked down at the signature line, already marked with a yellow tab. Divorce. Final. Immediate. Somewhere near the back of the room, someone lifted a phone higher. This was happening at the Hale family's Christmas party, their annual spectacle of wealth and influence. Gold ornaments glittered on a towering tree behind Connor, its lights reflecting off polished floors. Servers moved through the crowd with trays of drinks, careful not to slip on the broken glass at Elena's feet. Margaret Hale stepped forward, her lips tight with satisfaction. She wore deep red velvet and a diamond necklace that caught the light every time she moved her head. "We've indulged this long enough," she said, loud enough for everyone to hear. "Sign the papers and stop embarrassing us." Elena's chest tightened. 4 years. 4 years of marriage, of believing she belonged here somehow, boiled down to this moment. Her throat burned, but she refused to cry. Not here, not in front of them. She glanced at Connor one last time, hoping, against reason, that he might look uncomfortable, that he might hesitate. He didn't. His gaze slid past her, already finished with the moment. Elena lowered the pen to the page. Her signature came out crooked, unfamiliar, like someone else's name. The instant she finished, Connor took the papers from her hands. Margaret smiled and raised her glass again. "Security," she said softly. Two men appeared almost immediately, their dark suits blending seamlessly with the party's aesthetic. One of them touched Elena's elbow, not rough but firm enough to make the message clear. Connor pulled a few bills from his pocket and pressed them into Elena's palm. "For transportation," he said quietly, as if doing her a favor. "Take care of yourself." Elena didn't look at the money. She couldn't. The guards guided her toward the doors, as murmurs rippled through the crowd, some awkward, some amused, some indifferent. The doors opened, letting in a rush of icy air. Snow was falling hard outside. The moment she stepped onto the stone steps, the warmth vanished. Her thin coat did nothing to protect her as the guards released her, and the doors closed behind her with a final, echoing thud. The music resumed inside. Elena stood there for a second, stunned, watching her breath cloud in the air. Her wedding ring slipped off her numb finger and disappeared into the snow. She didn't go after it. She walked. By the time she found herself sitting in a vinyl booth at a nearly empty diner 3 miles away, her hands were still shaking. The waitress had brought her a cup of coffee she hadn't ordered. Elena stared at it, watching steam rise, while the reality of what had happened settled in. Divorced. Publicly. Thrown out like she had never mattered. Her phone buzzed weakly, 2% battery. Her bank app refreshed slowly, then loaded the number she already knew by heart, $243.18. Elena pressed her forehead to the cool surface of the table. The tears came then, quietly at first, then all at once. She covered her mouth, trying not to make a sound. She had cried enough in her life to know how to do it silently. After a few minutes, she wiped her face and straightened, forcing herself to breathe. She wasn't a child anymore. She had survived worse than this. She would survive this too. Her phone rang. She frowned at the screen. Unknown number. She almost let it go to voicemail. Almost. Something, instinct, exhaustion, maybe desperation, made her swipe to answer. "Hello? Elena Hart?" a woman asked. Her voice was steady, professional. "Yes," Elena said cautiously. "There's been a mistake in our records," the woman continued. "Your legal birth name is Elena Grace Hartwell." Elena let out a short, humorless laugh. "I think you have the wrong person." "I don't," the woman said. "I'm calling from Hartwell Group Legal Affairs. We've been trying to locate you for years." Elena closed her eyes. A scam. Of course it was. Tonight, of all nights. "I'm not interested," she said, and ended the call. Her phone rang again immediately. She sighed, answered. "I said, please," the woman interrupted. "Give me 5 minutes. I'm outside the diner." Elena froze. Slowly, she turned her head toward the window. A black sedan sat in the parking lot, engine running. A woman in a gray coat stepped out, followed by an older man carrying a leather folder. They walked toward the entrance. Her heart began to pound. The bell over the diner door chimed as they entered. The woman scanned the room, spotted Elena, and approached with measured steps. "My name is Rachel Moore," she said, extending a hand. "This is Thomas Keller. He's a private investigator." Elena didn't take the hand. "You're making a mistake." Rachel nodded, unfazed. That's what everyone says at first. Thomas placed the folder on the table and slid it toward Elena. "We're not asking you to believe us," he said gently. "Just to look." Elena stared at the folder, then at them. Every instinct told her to leave. But curiosity, dangerous, aching curiosity, kept her seated. She opened it. Photographs, documents, a birth certificate with her face stamped onto a different name, a DNA report, and a picture of a young woman holding a newborn, eyes hauntingly familiar. "That's your mother," Rachel said softly. Elena's breath caught. Rachel continued, "Your father is Samuel Hartwell, founder and majority owner of Hartwell Group." Elena laughed again, this time shakier. "That's not funny." "We know," Rachel said. "He's very sick, and he's been waiting a long time to meet you." Elena's phone screen went dark as the battery finally died. Outside, the snow kept falling, and for the first time that night, Elena felt something shift, subtle, terrifying, and irreversible. Elena stared at the photograph again, then pushed the folder back across the table as if it were burning her fingers. "This is insane," she said, her voice low but firm. "People don't just lose babies, and billionaires don't send lawyers to diners at midnight." Rachel didn't flinch. "They do when they've exhausted every other option." Thomas leaned back slightly, giving Elena space. "We didn't approach you lightly. We verified your records 3 times before coming here." Elena crossed her arms, suddenly aware of how damp her sweater still felt, how out of place she looked, sitting across from 2 people who radiated calm authority. "If this is a prank, it's cruel." "It's not," Rachel said. She slid one document forward. "This is the confession." Elena hesitated, then read. The words blurred together at first, but the meaning cut through quickly. A nurse, a mistake, fear, a decision that could never be undone. A child taken and raised under a different name. A letter written years later, left with an attorney when the woman fell ill. Elena's hands began to shake again. "Why wasn't I told?" she whispered. "Why did no one come for me?" Thomas answered carefully. "They tried, but the trail went cold. You moved through the system. Different names, different placements. It took time." "How much time?" Elena snapped. 24 years. The number settled heavily between them. Rachel softened her tone. "Your father never stopped looking. He funded search efforts privately. When the confession surfaced last year, everything accelerated." Elena pushed back from the booth and stood abruptly. "I can't do this," she said. This day." Her voice cracked and she turned away, pressing her palm to the window, staring out at the snow-covered lot. "I lost my marriage tonight. I don't have a place to sleep. And now you're telling me my entire life is wrong." Rachel stood as well, but kept her distance. "Not wrong," she said. "Incomplete." Elena let out a bitter laugh. "That's a generous word." Silence stretched between them, broken only by the hiss of the coffee machine behind the counter. "What does he want?" Elena asked, finally, still facing the window. "To meet you," Rachel said. "Nothing more, unless you choose otherwise." "And if I don't?" "Then we leave," Rachel said simply. "And you never hear from us again." Elena turned back slowly. "That's it?" "That's it." Elena looked at the folder again, at the photograph, at the handwriting in the confession that didn't look like something someone would fake. Her chest felt tight, like there wasn't enough air in the room. "Where is he?" she asked. Rachel's shoulders relaxed almost imperceptibly. "About an hour from here." They drove in silence. The car was warm, the leather seats soft beneath Elena's tense posture. The city thinned as they moved, farther out, replaced by quiet roads and tall gates set back from the street. Elena watched the landscape change, her reflection faint in the window. The estate appeared suddenly, lights glowing softly against the dark. It was understated in a way that felt intentional. No flashing displays of wealth, no dramatic architecture, just space, quiet, control. Inside, everything smelled clean and faintly of pine. Elena followed Rachel down a long hallway to a sitting room where an older man waited in a wheelchair near the fireplace. Oxygen tubing rested beneath his nose. His hands trembled slightly as he lifted his gaze. For a moment, no one spoke. Then the man's eyes filled with tears. "Elena," he said hoarsely. "I hoped, but I didn't want to assume." She stood frozen, staring at him. There was no dramatic recognition, no sudden certainty, just a strange pull, a familiarity she couldn't explain. "I'm Samuel," he said. "Your father." Elena swallowed hard. "You don't look like what I imagined," she said, then immediately winced. "I'm sorry. I don't know why I said that." Samuel smiled weakly. "I don't know what I imagined either, but I know this feels real." He gestured to the chair across from him. "Will you sit?" She did. They talked slowly, carefully. Samuel told her about her mother, brilliant, stubborn, warm. About the night Elena was born, the complications, the confusion, about waking up to an empty crib and a lifetime of guilt. "I should have protected you," he said quietly. "That's the truth." Elena listened, arms wrapped around herself. Tears slipped down her face without permission. "I grew up in foster care," she said eventually. "I bounced around a lot. Learned early not to expect anyone to stay." Samuel closed his eyes briefly. "I'm sorry." The word carried weight. It wasn't enough, but it mattered. Later, after Samuel was taken to rest, Rachel walked Elena back towards the guest room prepared for her. "You don't have to decide anything tonight," Rachel said. "Or ever." Elena nodded. "What happens if I stay?" "You learn," Rachel replied, "about the company, about the world you were meant to inherit, and about yourself." Elena lay awake long after Rachel left, staring at the ceiling. The room was too quiet, too large. Her mind replayed the night again and again. Connor's voice, Margaret's smile, the cold sting of champagne. She thought of the folder, of the confession, of Samuel's shaking hands, and for the first time since she'd stepped out into the snow, she felt something other than loss. Not hope, not yet, possibility. If you're still watching, and this story is pulling you in, make sure you like the video and subscribe, because what Elena chooses next changes everything. Outside the window, snow continued to fall, covering the ground in a clean, unbroken white. Elena wondered what it would feel like to start over, and whether the woman who walked out of that mansion earlier that night was already gone. Elena stayed at the estate for 3 days. She told herself it was temporary, a pause, a chance to breathe after everything had collapsed. But even as she said it, she knew that wasn't the full truth. Something had already shifted inside her, and there was no undoing it. On the second morning, Rachel met her in the kitchen with a tablet and a cup of coffee. "No pressure," Rachel said, sliding the coffee across the counter. "But if you're open to it, I thought we could talk." Elena wrapped her hands around the mug, absorbing the warmth. "About what?" "About what comes next," Rachel replied, "and what doesn't." Elena nodded slowly. "Okay." They moved to a smaller sitting room overlooking the garden. Sunlight filtered through tall windows, catching on frost still clinging to the hedges. It felt worlds away from the ballroom, where her marriage had ended. Rachel didn't start with money. She started with structure. Hartwell Group is large, she said. But it's not chaos. The company runs on systems, boards, legal safeguards. You wouldn't be thrown into anything blindly. I don't want to take someone else's life, Elena said quietly. I just found out it exists. Rachel studied her. That hesitation is the reason we're having this conversation. Elena exhaled. What about him? She gestured vaguely, meaning Samuel. He wants you to know the truth, Rachel said. What you do with it is your choice. But there is something else you should understand. Rachel tapped the tablet, pulling up a series of charts and documents. For the past 2 years, she said, your uncle, Victor Hartwell, has been acting CEO. Elena frowned. I thought my father. He stepped back when his health declined, Rachel said. Victor filled the gap. Publicly, he's respected. Privately, she paused. There are concerns. What kind of concerns? Financial irregularities, quiet settlements, partnerships that don't align with company ethics. Elena leaned back. Why are you telling me this? Because if you choose to acknowledge who you are, Rachel said, you become relevant to those concerns, whether you want to or not. Elena felt a familiar knot tighten in her stomach. Power, she realized, came with gravity. Once you stepped into its orbit, you couldn't float freely anymore. Do I have to do anything? Elena asked. No, Rachel said, but if you ever do, preparation matters. That afternoon, Elena visited Samuel again. He looked tired but alert, his gaze sharper than before. You don't owe me anything, he said as soon as she sat down. Not forgiveness, not loyalty, not involvement. Elena hesitated. Then why do I feel like I'm standing at the edge of something? Samuel smiled faintly. Because you are. She studied him. Did you know my marriage was like that? He shook his head slowly. I knew you were married. I didn't know you were suffering. Elena swallowed. They made me feel small, like I was lucky just to be there. Samuel's jaw tightened. No one had the right. Maybe they did, Elena said softly. I let them. Samuel leaned forward as much as his strength allowed. Let me tell you something I learned too late. Power doesn't come from where you start. It comes from what you refuse to accept. That night, Elena stood in the guest room again. Phone charging on the nightstand. Messages buzzed in from numbers she hadn't saved. Former co-workers. A distant cousin she barely remembered. Even Connor's name appeared once. No message, just a missed call. She didn't respond. Instead, she opened a notebook Rachel had left for her. The first page was blank. Elena wrote one sentence at the top. I don't want revenge. I want clarity. The weeks that followed were quiet but intense. Elena moved into a modest apartment in the city, under her own name. No press, no announcements. She met with advisors, not as an heir, but as a student. She listened more than she spoke. Asked questions she'd never been taught to ask before. She learned how businesses actually failed. Not in dramatic crashes, but in small compromises. She learned how power moved through rooms without ever raising its voice. She learned that money wasn't magic. It was leverage, responsibility, and consequence. Sometimes she felt like an imposter. Sometimes she felt angry. And sometimes, late at night, she felt an ache so sharp it took her breath away. Connor's world didn't disappear. It brushed against hers in unexpected ways. One afternoon, months later, Elena stood in a glass-walled conference room under a different name, Claire Monroe, listening as a mid-sized real estate firm pitched an expansion plan. She recognized the logo immediately, Hale Development. Her pulse quickened, but her expression didn't change. Across the table, Margaret Hale sat straighter, her eyes lighting up with interest. Connor sat beside her, older somehow, lines etched deeper into his face. He spoke confidently, but Elena caught the subtle tension in his shoulders. They didn't recognize her. "Ms. Monroe," Margaret said smoothly, "we're excited about the possibility of your involvement." Elena folded her hands. "Tell me about your risk exposure." Connor hesitated for half a second too long before answering. As they talked, Elena listened, not as the woman they had discarded, but as someone with options. She noticed the gaps, the overconfidence, the assumptions. After the meeting, Margaret approached her with a practiced smile. "You remind me of someone," she said lightly. Elena returned the smile. "People say that often." Outside, she paused on the sidewalk, heart racing. She hadn't planned this, but she understood now what Rachel had meant. Power didn't announce itself. It waited. If you're still here, don't forget to subscribe, because this is where the story starts to turn. Elena looked up at the city skyline, feeling the weight of what she'd learned and what she hadn't yet decided. She wasn't ready to step forward, but she was no longer willing to step back. The second meeting came a week later. This time, it wasn't Elena who sought them out. Hale Development requested her. "Claire Monroe," the email said. "Private dinner. Discretion appreciated." Elena stared at the message for a long moment before forwarding it to Rachel. "They're circling," Rachel replied, almost immediately. "That means they're exposed." Elena exhaled slowly. "I don't want to rush this." "You're not," Rachel said. "You're controlling it." The restaurant Margaret chose was quiet and expensive in a way that didn't advertise itself. Soft lighting, no logos, the kind of place where deals were made without paper. Connor stood when Elena approached the table. "Ms. Monroe," he said, extending his hand. "Thank you for meeting us." Elena shook it, her grip steady. "Of course." They ordered wine. Margaret talked about market conditions. Connor spoke about expansion, about vision, about legacy. Elena listened, asking questions that seemed harmless but weren't. "What's your current debt structure?" she asked lightly. Connor hesitated again. "We're well leveraged." Margaret jumped in smoothly. "All growth carries risk." Elena nodded. "Of course. I prefer clarity." Margaret smiled. "You're very direct." "I find it saves time." The conversation drifted. At one point, Connor studied Elena more closely, his brow furrowing. "Have we met before?" he asked. Elena met his gaze without flinching. "I don't believe so." Something passed through his expression. Confusion, then dismissal. He smiled and looked away. After dinner, as they stood to leave, Margaret touched Elena's arm. "We'd love to host you at our holiday fundraiser next week." Elena paused. "At your home?" "Yes," Margaret said, pleased. "It's a tradition." Elena smiled politely. "I'll consider it." That night, Elena sat alone in her apartment, lights low, city humming outside. She replayed the dinner in her mind, the way Connor had almost recognized her, the way Margaret assumed control without question. Rachel's words echoed. "They're exposed." Elena didn't feel triumphant. She felt alert. The fundraiser was crowded. Music floated through the house, softer than the Christmas party months earlier, but the energy was the same. Money, influence, comfort. Elena arrived late, dressed simply but impeccably. Conversations paused as she entered. Margaret spotted her immediately and crossed the room. "Ms. Monroe," she said warmly, "you came." "I did," Elena replied. Margaret guided her through introductions. board members, investors. Familiar faces that once looked through Elena without seeing her. Connor joined them, drink in hand. "I'm glad you made it," he said. Elena nodded. "So am I." They stood near the edge of the room, watching the crowd. Margaret leaned closer. "You have a good instinct," she said. "People like you don't stay on the outside long." Elena met her gaze. "Neither do people like you." Margaret laughed, missing the edge beneath the words. Later, Elena slipped away to the balcony. Cold air filled her lungs. Snow drifted lightly, quieter than that night she'd been thrown out. Connor followed a moment later. "I know this sounds strange," he said, hands in his pockets, "but I feel like I owe you an apology." Elena raised an eyebrow. "For what?" "For whatever it is I'm sensing," he said awkwardly. "You remind me of a version of myself I don't see anymore." Elena studied him. People change. "Not always for the better," he said. She didn't respond. Inside, Rachel watched from across the room. Phone pressed discreetly to her ear. "We're ready," she said quietly. Elena nodded once. The meeting was scheduled for the following morning. Emergency board session. Hartwell Group. The room buzzed with anticipation. Executives filled the seats. Legal counsel stood by the walls. Victor Hartwell sat at the head of the table, confident, relaxed. Elena entered last. Rachel announced her calmly. "Elena Grace Hartwell." The room stilled. Victor looked up, his smile fading. Elena took her place at the table, heart steady, voice even. "Thank you all for coming on such short notice." Victor recovered quickly. "This is highly irregular." "So were the transactions," Elena replied. Documents appeared on the screen behind her. Numbers, timelines, patterns that told a story without emotion. Victor's confidence cracked. Elena didn't raise her voice. She didn't accuse. She presented. By the time federal representatives stepped into the room, no one was surprised. Elena stood, smoothing her jacket. "This isn't about punishment," she said. "It's about correction." She left the room quietly. Outside, her phone buzzed. Dozens of notifications, missed calls, messages. One stood out. Connor Hale. She didn't open it. If this story has kept you watching, like the video and stay with me, because what Elena does next is the part no one expects. She stepped into the cold morning air, the city stretching out before her. The final confrontation wasn't going to be loud. It was going to be inevitable. Elena didn't return Connor's call. She didn't need to. The fallout moved faster than she expected. News broke quietly at first. An executive stepping down for personal reasons. A delayed merger. A postponed development project. People who understood how power worked read between the lines. Others felt the shift without knowing why. Hale Development's offices went dark, one floor at a time. Margaret Hale hosted one final board meeting before the lenders stopped returning her calls. She wore the same composed expression she always had, but it cracked when the numbers were projected onto the screen. The leverage she'd dismissed. The debts Connor had minimized. The investors who had already pulled out. "This can be fixed," she said sharply. "We've weathered worse." But no one agreed with her. Connor sat silently at the table, staring at the documents as if they might rearrange themselves if he looked long enough. He understood now. Not all of it, but enough. The investor who had asked the right questions. The timing. The doors that had closed all at once. That evening, he drove alone to the old house, the one that felt too big without an audience. Snow dusted the driveway. Lights glowed dimly inside. He poured himself a drink he didn't finish. His phone buzzed. This time, it wasn't Elena. It was the bank. Elena heard about it later, not from Rachel, but from a news alert that appeared on her phone while she stood in line at a cafe. She didn't open the article. She didn't need the details. Instead, she took her coffee to go and walked. A week later, she visited the cemetery. The ground was cold, the air still. 2 headstones stood side by side now, simple and understated. Elena knelt, brushing snow from the carved names. "I didn't know how to be both," she said softly. "Who I was, and who I am now." The wind moved through the trees, carrying no answers. "I'm trying," she added. "I hope that's enough." She stood and took one last look before turning away. Hartwell Group changed quietly under Elena's leadership. No press tour, no dramatic announcements. Policies shifted, transparency increased, programs expanded, education grants, housing initiatives, internships that didn't require connections to access. Elena visited one of the programs months later, standing at the back of a classroom as a group of young women listened to a guest speaker talk about careers they hadn't imagined for themselves. She didn't introduce herself. She didn't need to. One afternoon, as winter softened into early spring, Elena sat in her office reviewing reports when Rachel knocked lightly on the door. "There's someone asking to see you," Rachel said. Elena looked up. "Who?" Rachel hesitated. "Connor Hale." Elena considered this for a long moment. The memory of the champagne, the papers, the snow. The woman she had been then felt distant, not erased, but resolved. "5 minutes," Elena said finally. Connor looked smaller when he entered. Not physically, just diminished. He didn't sit until she gestured. "I know I don't deserve this," he said. "I just wanted to say—" Elena raised a hand gently. "You don't need to explain." He swallowed. "I didn't see you," he said quietly. "That's the truth, and now I can't unsee it." Elena studied him, searching for anger she no longer felt. "I hope you learn from that," she said, "for your own sake." He nodded, eyes lowered. "I hope you find what you were looking for." "I already did," she replied. When he left, Elena didn't feel relief or satisfaction, just closure. That night, she stood on the balcony of her apartment, city lights stretching endlessly below. The world hadn't become kinder. It hadn't become fair. But it had become honest. Elena thought back to the woman standing in the ballroom, pen shaking in her hand, believing she was losing everything. She smiled faintly. She hadn't lost her life that night. She had been given it back. If this story stayed with you, if it reminded you of your own strength or someone you care about, take a moment to like the video and subscribe. Stories like this don't always get told, but they matter. Elena turned back inside, closing the door softly behind her, ready for whatever came next. And that was the real beginning. Thank you for watching. Until the next story, stay strong, stay hopeful, stay inspired.